Then of adultery and of murder.
Having worked so hard to build up the character of David, it's puzzling that the writers of the Bible should now begin to reveal his flaws. Steve Mackenzie believes that this could be one occasion where the spin doctors didn't quite have the last word.
The Bathsheba story is kind of a mystery because it's so different from the surrounding material. After the spin doctors have painted their picture of David, then somebody else has come along and inserted this story of Bathsheba in that work. Exactly what the motivations of the person who inserted the Bathsheba story were, I don't know for sure. It may have been a way of saying, this is what happens when you get a king with supreme power. They commit faults. I think the irony is, I love the Bathsheba story. It may be my favorite part because he's not the innocent David. He's the David who is guilty of adultery, who has his flaws. But that's the David that we identify with.
The Bible writers may well have believed that David's reputation could withstand a bit of scandal. After all, he had achieved what must have seemed like an impossible feat, the unification of Israel. The irony is that today scholars are less sure that David did truly unify the country. The incident that casts the most doubt on David's achievements is a revolt. Led by the king's own son, Absalom.
The beauty of the Absalom revolt in historical terms is that it shows us that David was hugely unpopular. The entire population of Judah and Israel rise up against him. This man was hated, widely hated, and probably did not have widespread control of the countryside at the time.
The Bible plays down the revolt, blaming it all, in a rather modern twist, on poor parenting skills. It hints that it was David's leniency towards his children that enabled Absalom to rebel.
I think that the way that the spin doctors are using that element is to paint this portrait of David as gentle. Somebody who's too gentle to harm anyone certainly would not harm his own son.
The image of a gentle David makes some scholars doubly suspicious, because just as the revolt is stopped, Absalom is killed on the battlefield.
The reason why I'm suspicious at that point is because we have the same pattern here that we had with some of the earlier figures who stood in David's way. Namely, somebody dies violently, the text goes to lengths to say David had nothing to do with it, and when David finds out about it, he mourns profusely. That's exactly what happens with Absalom. And so, again, I think David is probably the one who's ultimately behind it.
The death of Absalom is a good indication of just how David held on to power.
The biblical story portrays the unification of Israel as an elective process. The people come together and they choose David to be their king. In reality, he was more of a conqueror than an electee. He governed by force. He united the people, sheerly by force of arms.
David's unified kingdom was not such a golden age after all. But the fact that it was unified at all may finally solve one of the greatest puzzles of this whole story. What drove the biblical spin doctors to paint such a glowing picture of David and his reign?
The history of Israel is a very long one, and it changes. And so by the time that the chronicler writes, Israel is no longer a united nation. They have been dispersed by foreign powers, and the chronicler is writing to try to unite the people who claim to be Israelites, unite them into one nation. And that's where David becomes kind of the model. This is who we want to be, who we once were. A united people under one ruler serving our God.
David died after 40 years as king, leaving his son Solomon to inherit the throne. Whilst the biblical David is a hero who unified Israel, the David of history emerges as a very different figure.
The David of tradition is a saint. The David of history was much more human. He ruled by terrorizing his people because he was a Near Eastern king. And no Near Eastern king stayed on the throne long except by dint of force.
It's an image of David that's more in line with the realities of the ancient world. And it's not so far removed from our own times.
To a large extent, we recognize in the historical David that human beings haven't changed over millennia. We're still grappling with the same problems and still struggling with the same issues. And one of those is people who grasp for power and hold on to it, and the extent to which they're willing to go.
David probably had all the flaws of the ambitious and the powerful. Perhaps these flaws may detract from the image of him as biblical hero. But without them, he may never have secured his place in history.